very warm welcome on behalf of Aleka Shepherd, the founder of the LSLC, and Francesca Cappa, the chair of the YMP committee. Welcome to this event on shipbuilding and marine engineering. The LSLC and YMP is extremely grateful to Haynes Boone, in particular Will and Fiona, and also Ian Gaunt for their very hard work in organising and putting on the event this evening and for preparing the content. Without any further ado, I shall hand straight over to Will from Haynes Boone, and I should mention that Haynes Boone are a new member of the LSLC, so a very warm welcome on that front. I'll hand over to Will, who is chairing this evening. I hope you all enjoy and find it useful.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. So today we're talking about shipbuilding and marine engineering. So essentially the building of conventional ships and more complex units that all of which float is the common theme. I think so. Is that one? That's what I think. Yes, you can hear me. Yes. So this is to reflect the very different shipbuilding market that we see now compared to the market that's existed for many years now, both in relation to the state of the market and also at the technical challenges that ship owners and shipbuilders face and are likely to face in the future. So if I can introduce the panel for this afternoon. First of all, Ian Gaunt, who I'm sure many of you know, who's an arbitrator, past president of the LMAA, and who has a great deal of shipbuilding experience since 1979, I'm told, particularly through his time as head of Carnival Corporation's shipbuilding program, and also as the co-author with me and Simon Curtis of the 5th edition of the Law of Shipbuilding Contracts. Still some copies available. Also on the panel, Andrew Stevens from Four Pump Court, who's also experienced in shipbuilding disputes. And in particular, he was the lead counsel in the well-known shipbuilding case of Jiangsu and Precious Shipping, which is a bit of shipbuilding history. So that's good. And finally, I'd like to introduce the Haynes Boone contingent, which is me and Fiona. Under Simon Curtis, CDG, which was the predecessor to Haynes and Boone, specialized from the start as a marine construction firm. So we have been heavily involved in shipbuilding and other forms of marine construction for many years.
Right, okay. Good evening, everyone. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the core components of shipbuilding contracts, and I'm also going to briefly touch on conversion contracts. This is very much an overview of a shipbuilding contract and an introduction for those of you, who I don't know that there's many in the audience, who are not familiar with shipbuilding contracts. For those of you who have negotiated shipbuilding contracts or dealt with disputes, this will not be new, but will hopefully provide you with some background for the rest of this evening's talk. So as you will see from the slide, I've identified 12 core components of a shipbuilding contract, and I will comment on each of these in turn. So the first core component of a shipbuilding contract on my list is the scope of work, or in other words, what does the builder have to build and how? The contract will contain a description of the vessel and set out the dimensions, gross tonnage, method of propulsion, speed, deadweight, and fuel consumption. It will also refer to the specifications, which will be annexed to the contract. The specifications are key. They will describe the vessel, her machinery, equipment, define the class and regulatory requirements, detail the methods and processes for the steel preparation, assembly, welding techniques, quality assurance and health and safety standards. It will also set out the tests for her machinery and equipment and contain plans and drawings, such as the general arrangement plan. So having looked at how the shipbuilding contract addresses what the builder is going to build, we now need to work out how the price will be paid, the buyer will pay for this. So shipbuilding contracts are typically concluded on the basis that the buyer will pay a fixed price for the vessel. The contract price will usually be paid in perhaps 4 pre-delivery installments, which are payable on the contract becoming effective or the provision of the refund guarantees. Secondly, the commencement of steel cutting. Thirdly, keel laying. And fourthly, launching. And then there'd be a final payment on delivery of the vessel. It is therefore common that a significant proportion of the price is payable before delivery. This payment structure, together with the fact that title to the vessel remains with the builder throughout the construction period, means that a shipbuilding contract will typically provide for the need for the builder to provide a refund guarantee to the buyer at the outset of the project. Providing a refund guarantee addresses the credit risk that would otherwise exist for the buyer by making advance payment, and is commonly a condition precedent to the buyer's obligation to pay the first pre-delivery instalment. The builder's bank, who will normally provide the refund guarantee, will typically commit to pay an amount limited to the aggregate of the pre-delivery instalments repayable to the buyer upon rescission, together with interest at a rate agreed in the contract. The key issue in most refund guarantee discussions is whether the guarantor's liability will be engaged immediately upon the buyer's simple demand for repayment of the pre-delivery instalments upon rescission, or only after the builder's liability has been independently determined by an arbitration or court proceedings, and the builder has failed to make payment. For either type, the refund guarantee will normally remain valid throughout the vessel's expected construction and outfitting period, with a margin to cover possible delays, and be subject to an overall cut-off date. From the buyer's perspective, though, it is important to ensure that any cut-off date takes into account potential delays in the completion of the project for which the builder will be entitled to an extension of the delivery date, and depending on the type of guarantee, any arbitration or court proceedings to determine liability. This is a topic that Andrew will come back to in his section of the talk, so I'll leave it there. Moving then on to performance guarantees. So I've already said that the scope of work includes key characteristics of the vessel. Some of these, typically speed, dead weight, and fuel consumption, are significant to the vessel's future employment prospects and are therefore subject to performance guarantees set out in the shipbuilding contract. Where the vessel does not meet these performance guarantees, the builder will be liable to pay liquidated damages. The amount of these liquidated damages increases, for example, depending on how far the actual speed achieved during sea trials differs from the guaranteed speed, and this is up to typically a maximum level, at which point the buyer will then have the option to reject the vessel and rescind the contract. Performance guarantees benefit both parties as they remove the difficulty of quantifying the losses suffered by the buyer if the vessel fails to meet the criteria, and provides the builder with certainty as to how much it will be required to pay and when the buyer may rescind the contract. So here I'm covering two topics in one under this heading, but taking each of them in turn. So approval of plans and drawings. During the construction programme, the builder will prepare working drawings. These are submitted to the buyer for approval and comments. This process seeks to avoid the costly technical errors and minimise any alterations that may be made at a later stage in the construction process. Procedure, however, is not intended to alter the basic division of liabilities under the contract. So the builder still remains responsible for the vessel's design, and the buyer's approval of plans will not usually make it responsible for the additional costs that the builder may incur. Turning to an inspection during the construction, the buyer is also entitled to maintain its own representative or supervisory staff at the shipyard during the construction programme. If it chooses to do so, the buyer's representative is generally authorised to attend tests and inspections of the vessel and her equipment throughout the construction period. Turning now to modifications and variations. Even with the detailed specification that I've mentioned, it is inevitable that there will be changes will be made prior to the vessel's delivery. Such modification clauses try to balance the wishes of the buyer to have the maximum flexibility to make changes at a minimum cost and time delay, and the builders wish to have the right to refuse variations unless the cost and time consequences have been agreed, as well as ensuring that any knock-on changes to the physical or performance characteristics of the vessel are properly addressed. Once the vessel has been completed, the builder needs to demonstrate that to the buyer that the vessel meets the standards set out in the contract and the specification before the vessel can be tendered for delivery. And as a result, trials have to be performed. The trials are also important in order for the vessel to be classed and certified by the Classification Society. Trials typically include dockside tests and inspections of the vessel, and a period at sea during which the builder will be required to demonstrate to the buyer the vessel's speed, endurance, maneuverability, and general seakeeping characteristics. Due to the complexity of a vessel, it is common for the trials to reveal some defects, which the builder will seek to rectify and to put the vessel in a deliverable condition prior to delivery. So assuming that the sea trials have been completed successfully and the defects rectified, the vessel will be ready for delivery. A shipbuilding contract will typically provide for delivery in a two-stage process. Firstly, the formal tender of the presentation of the vessel by the builder, and then the acceptance of the vessel by the buyer, evidenced by the execution of the protocol of delivery and acceptance, together with the physical possession and control of the vessel passing to the buyer's master and its crew. The next component of shipbuilding contract is the force majeure clause. If the contract is governed by English law, it is important to know that English law does not recognise the doctrine of force majeure. As a result, the contract must define what is meant by force majeure and the contractual consequences. Force majeure clauses are often a detailed list of events that may impact a builder's ability to perform the works, including, for example, natural events such as earthquakes, typhoons, and extreme temperatures, failures in performance by third parties, such as the builder's own subcontractors and suppliers, and failures by the buyer to perform its own obligations, which prevent the builder's performance on the project. Force majeure clauses have changed over time, and for example, now it's common to include pandemics and not just the plague and other epidemics and quarantines for reasons that I'm sure you all remember. The delays arising from events listed in the force majeure clause, which are accepted by the buyer, are often referred to as permissible delays. Force majeure provisions will not normally include negligent acts or omissions by the builder. The builder will need to notify the buyer when a force majeure event occurs and also when the delay has ended. Notice by the builder can be a condition precedent to the claim and provide that the buyer can waive its rights if it fails to respond to a notice of force majeure within the prescribed time. So another core component and the way to address risk is the post-warranty delivery warranty obligations. Under most large-scale shipbuilding contracts, the builder agrees to provide a warranty for any defects due to bad workmanship or use of defective materials. The warranty period is commonly 12 months from the date of the vessel's delivery and acceptance, but it's also common to see 18 or 24 months. In the event of a defect occurring during the warranty period, the shipbuilding contract provides that the builder will rectify the defect at its own cost. The builder will not, however, pay for incidental expenses and losses, including any loss of use of the vessel arising either from the defect or its repair, and these will be borne by the buyer. It is usually agreed that the builder's warranty will operate to the exclusion of any other contractual or statutory warranties regarding the vessel's condition or performance that might be available to the buyer. So what happens if things go wrong? This is dealt with in the termination clauses. I'm only going to touch on this as Andrew will be talking about this in his talk, but dealing firstly with builder's default. A buyer can typically exercise its right to terminate on the occurrence of certain defined events of builder's default. So these could be a delay in delivery. Where the builder fails to deliver the vessel on the delivery date, the buyer may be entitled to claim liquidated damages, and in the case of excessive delay, also have the option to rescind the contract. The delivery date may have been extended, though, due to modifications and variations in force majeure events. So the cancellation right may arise once the force majeure delays exceed a set number of days, for example, 210 days in the SAJ form, or on a specific date, commonly referred to as the drop dead date, which in the case of the SAJ form is 270 days from the delivery date. Andrew will come back to this shortly. Another event of default is the failure of the vessel to meet the technical requirements contained in the performance guarantee, which again will entitle the buyer to liquidated damages or reject the vessel and rescind the contract if the deficiency exceeds the maximum tolerance. Thirdly, there's also financial defaults, and sometimes they provide that the buyer has the right to rescind the contract if the builder commits a financial default, for example, appointment of a receiver or compulsory liquidation. The same right is often reflected in the buyer's default clause. And similarly, a shipbuilding contract can also usually provide for mutual rights of rescission in the event of total loss. In the event of termination by the buyer, they may be entitled to the return of the paid instalments, but it is not generally entitled to make a claim for damages. But this is possible where common law remedies have not been excluded. Turning now to one final core component of shipbuilding contracts that I'm going to talk about, and this is termination for buyer's default. For a builder, the buyer's key obligation is to pay the contract price. As the shipbuilding contract provides in the buyer's default clause, that as a minimum, the buyer will be in default if it fails to make timely payment of any instalment of the contract price. Another basis for termination is where the buyer fails to take delivery of the vessel that has been duly tendered by the builder. I've already mentioned financial default and total loss. So where a buyer is in default and, for example, has not paid an instalment of the contract price, this could entitle the builder to interest, an extension of time, and if the buyer fails to pay after a specified period of days, the builder will also have the option to rescind the contract. The builder can retain the paid instalments and choose to complete or not to complete the vessel and to sell it in order to mitigate its losses. Finally, and before I hand over to Andrew, just a few comments on conversion contracts. Conversion contracts are similar to new building contracts, and a lot of the same principles apply. In practice, they are a combination of new building contracts and a repair contract, but include some key differences. Firstly, there is the additional complexity caused by the interface risk between the old and new designs and materials in a single vessel. Secondly, as the vessel is currently an operating revenue-generating asset before the works are commenced, owners are keen that the minimum time is allowed to complete the works, and they seek substantial liquidated damages if this is not the case. And finally, title in the vessel remains with the owner throughout the conversion. As a result, the remedies on default are different, and they could include the owner normally wanting an option to remove the vessel to another yard for it to be completed there, with the original builder reimbursing any additional costs incurred. And the builder would want the right to cancel and claim the losses it has sustained if, for example, the owner fails to pay the instalments. Hopefully this has provided you all who are unfamiliar with shipbuilding contracts with a basic understanding of shipbuilding contracts. And Andrew and Will are now going to discuss the details of disputes and the impact of new technology.
Thanks, Fiona. This section of the seminar is going to cover a bit of feedback there. I think I might move the mic further away. is going to cover the common sources of disputes in shipbuilding and marine engineering cases. It's going to touch on as well the Jiangsu Guoxin case, which Will just bigged up as a piece of maritime law history. I don't think it's quite worthy of a Netflix serialization, but I'll try and do my best to make it as glamorous as possible. Now, I only have 15 minutes, and so I necessarily have to talk in generalizations. But although I'm speaking in general terms, it's really important to remember that each case can be very different from another, and what usually has the greatest influence on the merits and outcome of any shipbuilding case will be the specific wording in the contract, what the finance documents say, and what the specific facts are. So you have to obviously approach each case according to its different factors, which can vary greatly in shipbuilding cases. For instance, the complexity of the project can have a big bearing on how the case plays out. The more complex the project, the more complex terms you might see, and the more specific rights to reject a vessel might be contained in a contract. Also, the case will probably depend a lot on how much care and attention was put into amendments to the standard form, or in amending the wording, agreeing bespoke clauses, tinkering with refund guarantee wording, or with the warranty wording, or with delay and extension provisions can make a huge difference. And too often they're not sufficiently thought through. And the facts can be very surprising. The number of times you see often yards not doing the basics, like giving a notice, or where there's an express requirement to have a schedule and program in place using named programming software, and it's just not done. You think, no wonder you've got a problem establishing an extension of time. So all that will vary in each case, but back to my generalizations, I'm going to start by looking at when and why disputes often arise. Then we'll focus in on 3 key topics, and if time allows, we will look at a scenario and the mighty historical case of Jiangsu Guoxin. So when and why do disputes commonly arise? I've tried to identify 3 different periods of time to consider. Most of the fully blown disputes that I've acted on relate to the second period identified there, the crunch time, as I've called it for today. And the crunch time, or the end of the crunch time, often involves a termination. So a lot of the cases involve an issue of termination. But the disputes may have actually commenced a long time before the crunch time, but they often only come to a head during the crunch time, but not always. I'll explain later why it's often a big risk to seek to terminate before the end of the crunch time, and why it doesn't often happen. But as I said, that's not always the case. There may be a specific termination right that you clearly can rely on during the course of the project. So I mean, generally in this first period, lawyers might be asked for advisory input, and less often they'll be acting on a case. So in this first period, during the course of the build, what are some of the common reasons for disputes to arise? Well, a key one often is a fall in the value of the vessel, or a charter party rates falling away, or the charter party for the vessel disappearing. That's often a very bad argument to advance before an arbitrator. I doubt there's going to be a right in the contract to renegotiate or to reject the vessel for that reason, but for some reason, clients often think it's a key thing to stick under the tribunal's collective nose. A rise in the yard's costs, such as recent inflation events around the world, although probably not so much in China in some respects. A delay suffered by the yard, or even force majeure type events, can lead to disputes during the course of the build. Often the yard might want more money, it might need more money. I've seen yards go bust during the course of several disputes. The yard might want more time, but the parties might not agree on the causes of delay, or whether there's even a contractual entitlement to delay, whether the relevant notices have been served. And even if there is an entitlement to delay, how long should the yard get? But as I said, that will generally play out at the end of the crunch time when it comes to the drop dead date. Requests for changes in specification and modifications. These may cause extra delay, extra time to be required and extra cost. And in some circumstances, the parties can't agree that there's even a modification. There might be an argument about whether this is something new or not, something extra, or whether it's a correction for something that should have been done but was done badly, or whether there is a serial defect and that needs to be addressed. Is that a modification or not? But even if the parties do agree it's a modification, can they agree on how much money the yard gets? Can they agree on the amount of time? In one recent case I worked on, litigation did arise during the course of the build because a yard wanted/needed more money, said that there'd been a load of modifications that had to be paid for as quickly as possible. And if they weren't paid for, the vessel would be floated out of the yard at a very dangerous time to try to float a vessel and not worked on. So we had to go to the commercial court to get an injunction. But that's the rarer example of a case actually going to litigation during this phase. Another, I think, growing area of dispute recently and probably into the future is issues to do with financing and financial arrangements. I'm not talking about refund guarantees or non-payment or bankruptcy, which can lead to specific rights of termination, but where there's financing linked to the yard. So the yard or the yard's owner or the state might be funding the purchase installments or the final installment, and where there's a disagreement on what the loan terms mean or what kind of securities are required, that can lead to disputes. And I recently acted on an expedited arbitration that was decided within 3 months of the notice to award to work out whether financing could be provided and what security was needed so that the buyer could, on the day of tender, turn up with the money from the yard or the backer of the yard to actually pay the installment. So those kind of disputes arise. But as I say, it's more during crunch time that we see the disputes come to a head. Now, to explain crunch time, Fiona's just covered this. There are some key stages, the stage of sea trials and the need to formally reject or accept, and also the actual tender of the vessel. Do you accept and pay, or do you keep on saying, no, go back to work on this vessel, she's not ready? But often, even at those two stages, it takes a very brave buyer or a specifically worded contract to terminate at that specific stage. And I'll come on to this when I talk about deliverability. The buyers will usually wait for the drop dead date to accrue so that they can say a conforming vessel has never been tendered within the drop dead date. Therefore, we're terminating under the clear right to terminate under the charge party. So that brings us on to looking at, or will, termination, delay, and deliverability. But before we move on, the third group I've referred to is post-delivery disputes. So under the SAJ form, as you've heard, there's a very limited warranty. There can be disputes about whether a particular issue falls within that warranty, or whether the damage is a consequential loss and therefore can't be recovered under the wording of the warranty. I spoke earlier about amendments being made poorly. I was once in a Far Eastern jurisdiction with a Far Eastern non-English qualified lawyer who took a phone call about a draft contract that was about to be signed. And the conversation went something like, the buyer wants to change the wording about consequential losses in the warranty. Is that okay? Yeah, that's probably fine. Probably isn't if you look up the case law on consequential loss, and you might want to stop and think about it, be very careful what tinkering you do to that wording. Another common area of dispute recently has been upgrades to vessels that are in service, particularly adding scrubbers. I've seen dozens of disputes to do with scrubbers, allegations about poor design, poor workmanship, and then claims or counterclaims for non-payment under those contracts. Not as many as shipbuilding contracts, pure shipbuilding contracts, but that's another type of dispute. So there you go. They're the three most frequent areas. What about these three topics that I said I would cover? The first is termination. Termination can go very badly wrong if you're not careful. In particular, you need to check, if you want to terminate, whether you satisfy the requirements for the termination that you're about to purport to carry out. And a wrongful termination can be a repudiatory breach. So you've got to get it right. You've also got to consider the consequences or the relief of the termination regime that you've chosen. Does the refund guarantee bite? That's the key one. If you're the buyer, you want to know that you're going to get your installments back. So terminate under a regime that's going to trigger the refund guarantee if there's any doubts about what it does cover. Also, are the contractual remedies the opposite of the common law termination remedies? Doesn't often happen, but if they are, you've got to be really clear under which regime, common law or contractual, you're terminating. Otherwise, you could miss out on certain reliefs, or you've not made sufficiently clear which one you're terminating under, has there been a termination, etc. So pausing there, I've just mentioned the two regimes, common law termination, contractual termination, very basic, but it comes up a lot in shipbuilding contracts, so it pays to go over them again. Contractual termination is exactly what it says in the contract. The question is, do you fall within it? Are notices required? Have you given them in time? And what are your remedies? I've said why you need to look at that. For common law termination, of course, you're asking yourself, is there a condition in the contract that permits me to terminate? If not, is there an innominate term? And if so, has there been a sufficiently serious breach of that innominate term? Or has there been a renunciation, see above? And there can be uncertainty about all of those bases. What is a sufficiently serious breach? Is there actually a condition? So you can see when you're talking about the non-drop dead date termination, there's uncertainty. Also, you might need expert evidence to establish a breach. So that brings us on to the concept of deliverability. What we're talking about here is a scenario in which a buyer says that the vessel doesn't conform with the specification or is defective. So the buyer says it's entitled to reject the vessel when tendered for for delivery. It's undeliverable. So the question is, on what basis can a buyer reject or even purport to terminate the contract? Taking the SAJ form, probably the most popular form for new builds, in its unamended state, that may be a call about consequential loss. Be careful about the advice that you give. Taking the SAJ form in its unamended state as an example, the Sale of Goods Act terms, the implied terms, are excluded. So you can't fall back generally on fitness for purpose or satisfactory quality. Also, you have to ask, what is the test for working out whether you can terminate? There are a few possible contenders that get argued, some more meritorious than others, but two that I want to focus on are the common argument of there being an absolute requirement to conform with the provisions of the contract, subject to a de minimis rule. Question number one, what is de minimis? What counts as that? And what if you could quickly repair or do up whatever's lacking shortly after delivery? So is that a fit and sufficiently clear concept? There's scope for uncertainty. I think the more meritorious argument that I've seen run, or have run myself, is to treat compliance with the spec or the contract as an innominate term. But as I've already mentioned, what is a sufficiently serious breach of an innominate term of compliance with the spec? Is it that you can't get class certification? Is it that a geared bulker doesn't have cranes that work? Is it that the paint might chip in the holes? Is that a sufficiently serious breach? Is an alleged tendency to have stern tube bearing failures which cause the vessel to lose propulsional power out at sea, is that a sufficiently serious breach? All these are questions that I know have been asked, and you can see that there's room for argument and there's need for expert evidence to establish a breach of any of those requirements. And of course, you can see why shipbuilding dispute hearings can go on for 4, 5, 10 days, sometimes when there's a lot of expert evidence and legal argument as well. So you get the picture. It's risky for a buyer to terminate, and also the question of what is a deliverable ship is up for grabs. So you can see why there's this tendency to prefer termination for the accrual of the drop dead date, which brings us on to delay in the drop dead date. If a buyer, though, pause on this thought, if a buyer terminates on the drop dead date but it subsequently emerges that the yard is entitled to 1 day of extension of time. In theory, that means that the exercise of the termination right on the drop dead date wasn't properly used. Therefore, it was a repudiatory breach. So the need for clarity, the need for certainty as to where you are in terms of extensions of time and your delivery date is crucial. But also lurking behind that, we're getting onto the glamour now of Jiangsu Guoxin. Lurking behind that is the prevention principle. In short, it's an age-old concept in construction contracts generally, and we've been told by the TCC in shipbuilding contracts as well. A yard can't be prevented in its performance by a buyer who then says, oh, because you're late, yard, I get liquidated damages or a right to terminate. The prevention principle says, well, that shouldn't be the case. And where there's no extension of time provision that helps you out, yard, you're given a reasonable extra time, and time is at large. The term at large tends to terrify judges and arbitrators such that they always want to avoid the prevention principle coming into effect. There's effectively a rule that extension of time provisions will be construed broadly. So in that context, I'm going to show you something that I often use in hearings, a kind of table to summarize the diverse provisions that are found in many places within a shipbuilding contract on one slide that looks grotesquely complex, but it is a good way of distilling it. And there's going to be a bit of audience participation. I'm going to ask you your views. You can stick up a paw, you don't have to talk. But I'm going to set out on the slide that what were the delay and extension of time and termination provisions in the Jiangsu Guoxin case, which was a slightly amended SAJ form, and invite you to consider this scenario. Let's say one yard and one buyer have entered into a series of 10 shipbuilding contracts. The vessels have to be built in pairs, so 5 pairs, and they go sort of chronologically along a slipway towards the water. And the buyer, let's say it's established fact, the buyer has wrongfully terminated contracts 1 and 2, and that snarls up the whole of the rest of the slipway. So the buyer has caused the delay that's being suffered to all of the rest of the vessels. That blocks the yard's progress, and the yard says, we want an extension of time. And of course, the buyer should not be able to terminate the other hulls 2, 3, up to 9 and 10 for the delay that they've caused. Hold your breaths, everybody, or gasp. Here it is. Here is a tabularized version of the delay and extension of time and termination provisions in the Jiangsu Guoxin case. You don't need to look at it, the small print too closely, but see there are 3 main clusters. At the top, you've got excluded delays that give rise to an extension of time. Then you've got permissible delays, also give rise to an extension of time for the yard. Below that, non-permissible delays, no extension of time. Look at the right-hand side, where it's red. For excluded delays, the yard gets an extension of time and the buyer can't terminate. For as long as there's extensions of time for that reason, there's no drop-dead date in relation to that on its own. Why? Well, it makes sense because that top box is generally things that the parties have agreed or things that the buyer has done or caused. Next box down, permissible delay. You see at the end, there's a yellow box. After 180 days of that kind of delay or extension, the buyer can terminate. And you'll see that I've highlighted other causes beyond the control of the seller. Now, the question would be, does the yard get an extension of time for what the buyer's done wrong? It's something beyond the control of the seller, maybe arguably so. But if so, wouldn't that lead to a termination right after 180 days? So the buyer's done something wrong, and after 180 days, the buyer can terminate. Should that be allowed? So hands, paws in the air. Who thinks that if in the scenario that I set out, the yard should get an extension of time, but the buyer should be able to terminate? Great. For the camera doesn't show, I'll pretend that there's been a lot of movement in the room. Who thinks that the buyer shouldn't, whatever the opposite is of what I just said, that the yard the buyer can't terminate. I think hands up for the first proposition, none. Second proposition, okay. Lots of you think, well, you wouldn't have survived Jiangsu Guoxin in the commercial court. Zhoushan, a 2015 case, which was the case that everybody cited in these hearings, said that Article 8.1, so that big box in the middle, does not cover buyer cause delays. So you wouldn't get an extension of time for that. Jiangsu Guoxin, in effect, to avoid the prevention principle kicking in, the court said, well, actually, it does cover buyer cause delays and will exclude them from the 180 days by a reading of the contract that wasn't given to a similar contract in Zhoushan. So maritime history indeed, two conflicting cases that we're stuck with because we got permission to appeal and we were proceeding before the Court of Appeal, but the case settled when the pandemic kicked in. So we have these two decisions to contend with. I should point out that Mr. Gaunt, sitting on the end, was on both of the arbitral tribunals in Zhoushan and Jiangsu Guoxin, and the High Court agreed with Mr. Gaunt on both, didn't agree with me on Jiangsu Guoxin. A few other things to point out before I hand over the conch. You'll see that on this slide, the big box, Article 8.1, there's a column that talks about notice. Article 8.2 says that you need a notice for Article 8.1 extensions of time. And there's a question asked in Jiangsu Guoxin, does the Article 8.2 notice regime apply to any form of extension of time under the SAJ form? Answer in Zhoushan, Article 8.1 only Article 8.2 only applies to 8.1. Answer in Jiangsu Guoxin, Article 8.2 notice applies to all extension of time requests, unless there's a specific regime somewhere in the contract about notice for that particular extension of time. If you're a yard, pepper the world with notices. That's how you survive. Last 2 points. If there's a modification, if you don't agree an extension of time, Jiangsu Guoxin tells you, yard, you won't get an extension of time later. There needs to be certainty. And finally, if there's a late payment of an installment giving rise to an automatic right to an extension of time, it's not automatic. You have to give notice that you're exercising that option. There's the summary. I'm not going to read it out. It will be in the slide pack. And that's me done.
Thank you, Andrew. I can start. We can. My slides aren't that impressive, but you need to see them. So I'm going to talk about market trends and new technologies. And I'm first of all going to set the scene about the state of the shipbuilding market. There we go. Well done. Is that? Yeah. So I've been involved in shipbuilding not as long as Ian, but since the mid-90s. And during that time, there were a number of phases of the market. The first notable one was the enormous boom in the early 2000s. Shipping had a huge boom time, and that reflected, or that was followed by a boom in shipbuilding. Owners were desperate to place ships with yards and to get delivery as quick as possible, to take advantage of the very high freight rates that there were, and also to lock in shipbuilding prices that were going through the roof. Because the main yards had long lead times, the owners were placing shipbuilding contracts with less experienced or with new yards. And the yards were keen to also make hay, and were taking orders, hoping that they would be able to grow their capacity in sufficient time to actually build all the ships that they'd agreed to build. And I think that period really was at the Wild West of the shipbuilding market. And there were two examples that summed it up for me, which were two things that we were involved in at CDG. And the first was a shipbuilding contract and we didn't recognize the shipyard. So we did some research, and we found, in fact, it wasn't a shipyard at all. It was a factory. In fact, not just any old factory, but a factory that had previously been quite well known for making hairdryers. But it decided that ships were going to be much more profitable. And this was its bid into the shipbuilding market. Fortunately, the clients saw sense. And despite the fact that there were no other orders, so they'd have in theory got a quick delivery, they decided not to go ahead. And on a similar vein, we had another contract we were asked to review. Again, we didn't recognize the yard. So we did some research and found that in fact, it wasn't a yard at all and had no facility at all. But what it said it was going to be able to do was to be able to borrow some facilities from the Navy so that it could build the client ship. Again, the clients decided not to go ahead with that. And the other noticeable thing, I suppose, about that era was just the power, and this I think is probably going to be relevant in the years ahead, but the power that the shipyards had. In any shipbuilding project, there's inevitably some sort of attempt to increase the contract price by the shipyard by asking for or saying things are variations or it's entitled to additional money. But what was notable about that period was often there was really no attempt to try to link it to any contractor right at all. Essentially, it was if you want this ship, you're going to have to pay more. And if you don't pay more, then it goes to the back of the queue. And the owners decided that the cost of that to them was a lot less than the cost of either a very substantial delay to the delivery date, and therefore missing out on the freight rates, or even worse, if the contract was cancelled, then they go to the back of the queue with another yard and get a ship a lot later for a lot higher price. So that
miss out on earning $180,000 a day.
Exactly. But that all came to a crashing halt with the financial crisis in 2008. Ship values plummeted, freight rates plummeted. Often buyers couldn't take delivery, they couldn't finance the delivery installments, and many yards went bust. And I would say from my perspective, in general, since that time, it has really been a buyer's market. It has not been a good market for shipyards in general. There's one exception to that. Well, there's a few minor bumps along the way, I would say, or hills along the way. But one sort of significant exception was the oil price boom in the early 2010s. That resulted in a huge number of offshore units being built. And that was a sort of a mini boom in that sector. And that came to a crashing halt in 2014 when the oil price crashed from $100 a barrel to $26 a barrel. And since then, obviously it varies between some types of ships up a bit, but generally it's been a pretty depressed market for the shipyards up until relatively recently. But now the market is turning, or I would say possibly has turned to a builder's market. And I think there are some signs that that may be a long-term trend. And that's for a number of reasons. First, relatively few ships have been built since 2008. So the world fleet is not as big as it might otherwise be. And secondly, a lot of the ships that were built pre-2008 are now approaching middle age. And they're also built for a very different environment. They were built for speed and for high cargo carrying capacity. So they had big thirsty engines and high block coefficients. So effectively, they're not very streamlined. And that makes them expensive to trade and going to be difficult to trade in the current market where environmental factors are becoming increasingly important. The other reason is it's likely to be more difficult to significantly increase the shipbuilding capacity. As I said, in the pre-2008 boom, the capacity of the yards grew very quickly and in many cases with bad consequences. But that was a function really of China appearing on the scene. The path of shipbuilding worldwide has basically followed cheaper labor from Europe and in particular the UK in the 1970s. Then it moved to South Korea in the 1980s, and then China became a very dominant force from the 2000s. But China's costs have been rising. And what is maybe different this time is that there is no obvious challenger country. There's no country that is going to be able to produce cheap ships at a much cheaper price with much cheaper labor. And certainly not on the scale to compete with China. And just a depressing statistic, I think, for anyone who's involved in shipbuilding in this country, is in the 1890s, the UK built 80% of the ships worldwide. And now that figure, or that percentage, is pretty much negligible. Meanwhile, China is now building over 50% of the ships coming out of yards. So the balance of power has changed dramatically and very much against certainly the UK shipbuilding industry. The last reason why it may be different this time round is that the shipbuilding is now concentrated in relatively few very large players in China and South Korea, and they are going to be incentivized to protect their market and not flood the market with a large amount of additional shipbuilding capacity. So while of course it's all a matter for the crystal ball, there are some signs that we could be in a phase now where it's going to be a builder's market for quite some time. And there are two consequences of that. The first is that the standard shipbuilding contract doesn't give much protection in a rising market, and that's much protection to the buyer. The main weapon in a buyer's armory is its right to cancel the contract and claim a refund plus interest. But in a builder's market, that is an option the buyer often won't want to take, because it simply means that it goes to the back of the queue at another yard to place a ship with a much longer delivery date and for a higher price. And also, the second consequence is that in any event, under a standard shipbuilding contract, the buyer's rights in relation to defective work are relatively limited. So before delivery, you can technically reject the ship, as Fiona said, and you might be able to cancel. But again, does the buyer want to cancel? After delivery, again, as Fiona has said, the rights of a buyer are relatively limited under the standard forms. And in the builder's market, there's going to be much less chance to persuade the shipyard to amend its terms. Certainly in the sort of pre-2008 days, buyers were often simply presented with the builder's standard form and said, take it or leave it. So moving on to the risk from new technologies. In my view, in my experience, there are basically two main causes of shipbuilding disputes. One is the change in market conditions, and the second is technical challenges. And the shipbuilding contract is a fixed price contract for the sale of goods not yet constructed. And the bid price is based upon the shipyard's cost estimate plus an allowance for possible increases in time and costs. But new technology inevitably will increase those risks and result in unforeseen costs and delays and disputes. So just touching on some of the normal stages of a shipbuilding contract. There are 4 stages of design. They're often called different things, and sometimes they're 3, sometimes they're 5, but broadly speaking, there is the basic concept design, then there is the basic design, which is still relatively high level. Then you produce the contract design, which is the design against which the yard prices the contract, and then the detailed design, which is where everything goes and all the specification for all of the equipment. Again, in my experience, technical problems often start very early, and they just start in the design phase. And the important thing to realize is that the progression of the design is not linear. It follows what's called a design spiral. So the basic design will lead into the detailed design, but then issues with the detailed design will mean that you have to change something fairly major. You go back to the basic design. That requires further changes to the detailed design. So it's not a straight road. And shipyards are often keen to start construction as soon as they can. And that's for 2 reasons. The first, obviously, is they're worried about delays to the project. And the second is that often their cash flow is linked to milestones of physical construction. So they will be keen to try and get cash flow into the project. And often detailed design isn't sufficiently complete when construction starts. And that greatly complicates the consequences of any design defects. So now just looking at briefly some of the technology risks. Some of these we've sort of touched on, so I'm not going to say much about them, but these are the likely outcomes if you have a technology problem which arises, particularly if it arises early in the project. First of all, excessive cost and delay, particularly if construction has been progressed. Then the risk of failure to achieve the performance guarantees, and Fiona's talked about those. Increased risk of post-delivery defects. And again, the buyer is quite exposed to post-delivery defects under the standard wording. And particularly in the current phase, and the increased complexity of ships, and the fact that they are now being designed to be future-proof, to be able to accommodate future fuels, etc., is you need to consider whether there's any provision if the ship has been designed to accommodate a different type of fuel in the future. By the time that is actually tested, you may be long outside the warranty period, and therefore the buyer would have no remedy if it turns out that it doesn't actually do what it's supposed to do. And the other issue with increased technology is the increased risk of latent defects. Again, normally a standard warranty clause will not protect a buyer against latent defects. So just touching on how to mitigate some of these technical risks. The first point is be clear in the contract about design responsibility, and in particular avoid split design responsibility. As I said, you have the basic design, which is often done pre-contract, and you have the detailed design, which is normally done by the shipyard after the contract. And sometimes you will see that the buyer produces the basic design and remains responsible for it in the contract. And then the idea is that the builder builds on that basic design to build the detailed design. But as I've said, the progression of design is not linear. So it's often very difficult to work out whether the problems with design originate in the basic design or arose because of the detailed design. Again, because the contract protections for a buyer in a rising market are limited, it's really important that the buyer's site team review and inspect the builder's work, particularly during the design phase. And also, and it's not a non-legal point, but often the buyer's protections lie outside the shipbuilding contract in the due diligence it carries out on the shipyard, but also importantly, with the way the market is going at the moment, on major subcontractors, because major subcontractors may be the only people that know how the really complicated technology on the ship are working. And the last 2 points I was going to make is on the contract timetable. Often these projects are concertinaed, and so delivery is pushed forward as early as possible. But it's really important for the buyer, particularly if it has limited contract protections, to provide enough time for the builder to carry out the design and engineering before it starts construction. And even having something in the contract that provides a contractual gate for construction. So the shipyard cannot progress construction until it's reached a certain stage of design. And again, during the construction phase, it's the review and inspection rights of the buyer that are key. So if I just leave 2 messages that I would like you to take away. The shipbuilding contract only provides limited protection for the buyer. And in a builder's market, that protection is likely to be less. So the buyer needs to take extra steps to ensure that the project succeeds, both through increased due diligence of the yard pre-contract and increased inspection during construction. And also, and perhaps most importantly, allowing the shipyard sufficient time to complete the design before it actually starts construction. So that was all I was going to say, but we wanted to take advantage of having Ian with us as an experienced arbitrator, and so we have clubbed together and we have got some questions for him. But if anyone has got different or more interesting questions, then I'm sure he will be happy to answer any that you have. But in the meantime, if we can start with our first question, which is how much material needs to be served with the claim submissions when the dispute involves complex issues?
Well, the LMAA terms, and I'm assuming that we're talking about LMAA arbitrations principally here, are pretty much front-loaded. The intention is that the documentation which is supposed to support the claim is served up front rather than leaving the whole process to the stage of disclosure. In the case of a shipbuilding contract, inevitably the shipbuilding contract, in the case of a shipbuilding contract dispute, the shipbuilding contract itself is going to be the core document which is going to need to be served up front. If in the sort of case that we were talking about earlier, Andrew was talking about, the dispute is as to whether the ship has been delayed beyond the drop dead date by the activities of the buyer's inspectors, who it's claimed perhaps have obstructed the progress of construction in such a way that the drop dead date has been missed, then you're going to have a whole mass of documentation in the form of meeting notes, in the form of probably witness statements ultimately too. So the answer is, as in many legal questions, it all depends. It depends on the nature of the dispute. And we've really covered a number of different standard disputes in shipbuilding. The type which we saw in 2008, 2013, that was delay cases where the shipyard simply couldn't deliver the ships on time and was trying to find an excuse for being able to extend the drop dead date. Normally they couldn't and they lost. Increasingly, as we have said, the disputes are likely to focus on technical issues. For example, I have a case at the moment involving the installation of a scrubber. Would the scrubber work? Was it, and when you find latent defects outside, what may be the guarantee period, how you're going to deal with those types of things. So some of that technical information is going to have to be served, if not with the claim submissions, then probably with reply submissions or at the submission stage, rather than waiting for the process of disclosure. But in shipbuilding contract disputes, those of you who are familiar with them will know that in the vast majority of cases, you are going to have to go through a detailed process of disclosure or discovery. It's not going to be sufficient merely to have the documents exhibited to the claim submissions. And indeed, as the submissions develop, you will see that the issues will tend to become better defined, and as a result, you will come to understand better what documents are going to be needed in order to support that case. What the LMAA terms actually require in the second schedule is that the submissions have got to be accompanied by paginated supporting documentation relevant to the issues between the parties. And that could, in fact, theoretically involve also documents which don't necessarily support your case, but the normal practice is to serve those documents which support the submissions that you're making and the assertions that you're making, and then you wait for the other party to serve documents which support their case. And then ultimately you will get into the process of discovery with red fern schedules and all the rest of this sort of paraphernalia, and it can be a very complex process. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. So the second question we had picks up on the technical nature of shipbuilding arbitrations. What is the most effective way to present technical evidence?
Well, again, it all depends what the technical evidence is and what the technical dispute is. But I think one of the issues is, of course, experts, not all of them, because there may be some of them in the room who are, of course, completely independent and don't favor any of the parties who appoint them, but we do come across one or two who do. And the process that we normally go through is that each party will appoint its own expert, and the issue probably at first instance is whether the service of expert reports should be sequential or simultaneous. If it's simultaneous, then each side is going to want to have a comeback, and that can also extend the process. So sequential or simultaneous service of expert reports. And then at some point, the experts are going to have to get together and decide what they can and can't agree. And that can narrow the issues very substantially if they approach this in a constructive way. A lot of issues on which they at first sight perhaps seem to disagree can be agreed, and the tribunal then ultimately in the hearing can focus on those issues which are still in dispute. And then beyond that, at the hearing, you might have to consider how the experts are going to give their evidence. And in many large-scale construction disputes, and I think that's been led by technical civil engineering construction disputes rather than shipbuilding contract disputes, there is a preference among some arbitrators and parties for hot tubbing of experts, where you put all the experts together and you ask them the same questions essentially, and see what their reaction to those questions is. It's a process which, in my rather limited experience of it, has to be very carefully managed. One of the cases that I dealt with, the arbitrator concerned, it was a safe port dispute. The chairman of the panel had a very good list of questions which were put to the experts. We went through the whole hot tubbing process. And then we had cross-examination of the experts in turn by counsel, and the whole process started again. We might just as well not have had the hot tubbing at all. Counsel just ignored the whole process, in effect, and simply went their own way, just as if there had been no hot tubbing process at all. So it was a complete waste of a day, in effect. But if the process is managed well, and if the tribunal is strong enough to perhaps intervene in relation to counsel's cross-examination, then it can be effective, and it can help to define the issues and stop the experts passing like ships in the night, as is not uncommonly the case.
Good, thank you. Yes, I've tried hot tubbing. I think it's rather good, but we had the same problem, which was our expert then had 2 rounds. He was then cross-examined fully, and I don't think the tribunal there really stopped it. But it seems to be very efficient. Although people say that it's important that the tribunal needs to be sufficiently up to speed to be able to kind of run it, which is sometimes difficult.
Definitely, it's almost like cross-examination by the tribunal, and tribunals in London are often very reluctant to intervene in that sort of way, just as they're reluctant to appoint their own experts, for example, sometimes for very good reasons.
Yeah, good. So the next point was a shipbuilding project, by the time it gets to an arbitration, is generally quite a complicated story. And how is the best way to tell that story to the tribunal?
Well, we had an interesting debate about that this afternoon, because in the commercial court, I understand the court has issued directions whereby your ability to tell the story is has been very much circumscribed, or the way in which you can tell the story has been circumscribed. I find that the most useful way to get a handle on a case just before a hearing is through the skeleton, as long as the skeleton is proportionate, if I could put it that way, that it's not, that it is a skeleton and not a fleshy, full-blown argument. I know, I think in the commercial court and sometimes tribunals will limit the number of pages that the skeleton has, but the skeleton will normally contain some sort of narrative. And I generally find that very helpful. But then to find that counsel will go over the whole ground again on the first day of the opening, I don't necessarily find so helpful, having spent the weekend reading the skeleton, reading the documents which are referred to in the skeleton. And I think time might be capable of being saved in hearings by sometimes having shorter openings, but my colleagues, particularly from the bar, may disagree with that. What we also, however, think is often useful is for the parties to agree on a chronology before the hearing. And that can be, for example, in tabular form, and where there are points of disagreement, they can be identified. But essentially you have a narrative which can be developed, and the witness evidence can be developed around that. It's not necessarily for the witnesses to tell the story, and of course, examination in chief is now more or less non-existent. So the opportunity for a witness, except in his written statement, to tell a story is very limited anyway. But now, of course, there are guidelines which suggest that witnesses should only be confining their evidence to things which are within their personal knowledge, and they should not be, for example, introducing whole swathes of documents which can be perfectly well read by the tribunal without the witness talking about them in the witness statement. So a chronology before we start, or the skeleton, are often the best places, in my view, to hear the story for the first time.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, the next one is probably the most important question for anyone who appears before Ian. What are your pet hates in arbitration?
Well, I have quite a number. In fact, I was trying to draw up a list, but I didn't have enough paper. The one which is I think really springs out is the conduct of solicitors, or not necessarily solicitors, also foreign lawyers, in their inter-party correspondence. And one sees this, it's been going on for years. It's possibly got worse again recently, where solicitors just engage in a slanging match against each other. And not only do they engage in their slanging match, which perhaps their clients are prepared to pay for, but they also copy all this to the tribunal. But it's not clear what the tribunal is supposed to do about it, other than treat it as being effectively prejudiced. And the tribunal gets very fed up with it. So I have a case at the moment, a small claims procedure case, where the solicitors, club representatives in one representing one party, are just at each other's throats, and they're constantly using hyperbole and rhetoric about being frustrated, and they find costs are being incurred by the other party. Well, I can see this. I've been an arbitrator for 16 years, for God's sake. I don't need to be told this by the parties. And then I'm sometimes told that my duty under Section 33 of the Arbitration Act is to devise efficient means of handling the case. Well, I rather think I know how to do that, and that's presumably why the parties selected me as an arbitrator in the first place. So those are practices which are thoroughly to be discouraged, and in particular, the practice of airing prejudicial statements in front of the tribunal. And a lot of it is just playing to the gallery. It's trying to impress your clients that you're being aggressive and that you're doing something about it and you're fighting hard and so on and so forth. But unless you're making an application to the tribunal for something, it's totally pointless, in my view, to copy correspondence to the tribunal. It's of course very easy now in the days of email to just press the copy all button, but it's thoroughly to be discouraged. So I could list a few more pet hates, but that's
a good one. That's a good one. I think actually when I started, the LMAA sent a message round to all the London firms doing shipping law to distribute among all of their lawyers, telling everyone to calm down, because I think people were fed up, but it's obviously a perennial problem. So the last question we had for Ian is in relation to Redfern schedules, and what is the most effective way for a party to either set or respond to a Redfern schedule?
Well, in terms of setting a Redfern schedule, I think that you first of all really have to focus on what the issues are, which the documents you're seeking are supposed to be relevant to. And I would expect any Redfern schedule, but they don't always, to identify in relation to each document or category of documents which is asked for, the particular issue, pleaded issue, which the documents are said to be relevant to. Because it's no use just asking for documents and giving some rather vague description of the reason you suggest that the documents aren't relevant. They are supposed to be relevant to pleaded issues. So I'd expect to see a column dealing with that in every Redfern schedule. I'd also expect the party making the application, if it's not going to waste a lot of costs, to really refine the request to reduce, as far as possible, the classes of documents that it is asking for. There is a tendency to just, partly possibly as a glorified fishing expedition, to ask for vast categories of documents and all the correspondence relating to X, Y, and Z, and so on and so forth, which can very probably not relevant in the first place to pleaded issue, and secondly are going to waste a huge amount of costs. And it's only the other party is only going to come back. Then ultimately, maybe you have to have a hearing before the tribunal to be able to really define what documents are being asked for. So the categories of documents and disclosure really need to be refined, and some thought has to be given before you ask for classes of disclosure in a Redfern schedule.
Thank you. Yes, I've seen an order actually recently where the tribunal basically made clear that their answers to the Redfern schedules were just going to be yes or no. They weren't going to refine, made them too wide. You did so at your own risk, which I thought was probably quite
yes, these are procedural directions that the tribunal is not obliged to give reasons for, and will probably not give extensive reasons as to why it is granted or particularly why it's refused a particular request.
Good, thank you. So those are all of the questions we had for Ian. So if unless anyone has got any questions for Ian or anyone else, yes.
Can I just ask Ian, you made reference to the two approaches, basically contrasting approaches to how experts are dealt with, the hot tubbing, and to use your phrase, the expert ships which pass in the night. Is there not something to be said for a more formal procedure for recalling experts following the initial cross-examination, so that specific points can be dealt with in more detail, specific points of disagreement?
A little bit of difficulty with hearing, actually. Could you...
Might be easier without this.
Yeah, your question is about different ways of approaching
yes,
dealing with expert evidence.
Yes, basically. Can you hear me now?
That's better, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, is there not something to be said for a formal procedure for recalling experts after the initial normal cross-examination of each expert, so that specific points can be explored further?
Recalling it in the context of the hearing, or in...
Yes, in the context of the hearing.
So when they've been cross-examined once, you hear the other experts' cross-examination, and then you get the first expert back and ask them further questions?
Yes, I think it can be useful.
It could be in an appropriate case. I think tribunals are generally pretty passive when it comes to the process of cross-examination, and indeed asking questions. I mean, some are more interventionist than others, but particularly, for example, where you have a tribunal where there is at least one technically qualified member of the tribunal, then one might expect them to ask questions either after the cross-examination of the witnesses in sequence, or possibly to come back and say that they want some further input on them. But that is rarely done in my experience.
Yeah, yes, from my point of view as a technically qualified arbitrator, I do sometimes feel that after both experts have been cross-examined, there are points that I wish to revisit possibly with the first expert, points which have arisen in the second cross-examination. And okay, there may be a bit of to and froing. It may take up a bit of time, but I think it
That
can.
might be a point in favour of hot tubbing, actually, because you have then both the experts there at the same time, and that process would be, you would have to think in the first instance of the questions you were going to ask of the experts in the hot tub, or counsel would, and then if points arise in the process of the hot tubbing, then the tribunal can ask further questions of the experts while they're there.
Possibly, but I'm not sure that the right questions are evident at the start. But anyway, that's just, it's a point of view.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I think it's an interesting contribution. And as counsel, I wouldn't be opposed to cross-examination happening first and then some form of hot tubbing happening afterwards. But I say that as counsel who wants to essentially control things. And in the reality is that not all experts are equal. Some take very different approaches to the independence question. Some are far more experienced at giving evidence and appearing before tribunals. Some know their subject matter a little bit better than others. So hot tubbing, when you're not in control of it as counsel, can be quite nerve-wracking unless you're blessed with the amazing, really experienced, extremely capable at advocacy expert.
Ladies first. Ladies first.
Okay. Sorry, I'm an architect, so I understand the contracts, and it's reassuring that there's a similarity. But what I'm not sure about is maneuverability. I mean, I think there'll be a sort of nasty thing on both sides, either the builder and the buyer, if the maneuverability of the ship doesn't pass muster, being a shipping term, I suppose. But so can the builder take out insurance for failure of performance of things like maneuverability? Because I can see how you might adjust speed, but I can't see how a shipbuilder might, if he fails on the maneuverability, how that could be adjusted. I mean, is insurance available?
Well, I think it might depend on
Yeah,
what the reason for the lack of maneuverability is. I mean, if it's a design defect, then I think shipyards can take out insurance against design defects, or against, particularly if the design has been bought in from a third party, as is not uncommonly the case. If it's due to a purely that the steering mechanism is itself deficient, then again, I think that depending on who it had been supplied by, the shipyard might be able to insure itself against that exposure. But I think in all these cases, the exposure would be limited in terms of the amount that would be payable by the insurers, and you'd have to probably go through quite a lot of hoops before you get the insurers to pay out.
Okay, I'm going to be very greedy and ask another question, because in construction you have statutory adjudication. So how do you? I haven't read your book yet. So, but how do you deal with?
I'm going to auction it.
I don't know. I hope it's up to date. But
it's almost out of print, so you can now have your opportunity to file.
Signed? Is it signed? So how do you deal with disputes during the construction process of the ship?
That's an interesting question. Well, I've had, in fact, quite a lot of experience of that, because I used to run the shipbuilding function for a major cruise line, and most of the shipyards we were dealing with were shipyards with which we had a long-standing relationship. We didn't necessarily want to fall out with in a big way unless there was a really big issue. So a lot of technical issues will be solved in the yard simply by discussion between the technical supervisors or by the personnel of the yard and the buyer. You can then, and most shipbuilding contracts have a mechanism for doing that, you can refer to class sometimes if it is a class issue. The class will normally only give you an opinion or a decision on something which is a matter of interpretation of the class rules. And then they will usually refer it to their head office, not to it won't be dealt with by the local class surveyor. If it's not a class issue, there is provision usually in the shipbuilding contract to refer disputes to a technical expert who would not necessarily be acting as an arbitrator, something a little bit like the process of dispute boards that you have in civil engineering contract cases, and you can make provision for that decision to be final, so that it doesn't delay the project by having a major. So it depends somewhat on the relationship between the buyer and the yard. If it's simply a one-off contract, then you might be more likely to find yourself in arbitration ultimately. In shipbuilding contracts, in my experience, and my colleagues may have different experience, dispute boards have been rarely used, unlike civil engineering contracts where they're used all the time. It depends on the nature of the dispute. Technical experts are very, very rarely used in my experience. So if you can't really resolve the technical issue between the yard and buyer personnel, then the chances are that you're not going to go to technical. Sometimes there's provision for mediation, fairly rarely used in my experience in shipbuilding contracts. So you might often find yourself in arbitration, which hopefully will not actually delay the process of building the ship.
Right, thank you. Thanks.
Very briefly on your question about design, and this is the importance of wills. I'm not going to call it advice. No, on your question about design, I'm not going to call it advice, Will, because it's obviously not legal advice, but his suggestion that you think very carefully about the clauses in your shipbuilding contracts to do with design is key. The number of disputes that have come down to an issue of design when the contract is almost totally silent on it is staggering. A lot more thought needs to be put into the drafting of those provisions.
Yes, I mean, you can have an expedited arbitration, for example. I've come across cases where a ship has been very, very close to delivery, and the buyer has said, I'm not going to want to take delivery of this ship because the welders in the Philippines are welding under their umbrellas or something, and the ship is about 7 days away from delivery and so on. And we got an arbitration up and running very rapidly in order to deal with that very specific point. So it can be done in that way.
New technology and risk. There is a lot of publicity about the possibility of introducing nuclear power into merchant ships. Building yards have no experience of that. Commercial ship operators have no experience of nuclear power. The only people who might have the experience are those providing the plant itself. First question, have you come across anybody who is at all interested in nuclear power as a form of propulsion, either providing or as a ship owner? And probably the answer to that is no at the moment. But the other point is this likely to lead or to require a change to shipbuilding contracts so that the provider of the power plant has to be a party not only to the building contract, but also to the ship operating contract thereafter, because there is an element, huge element of continuation training in the operation of nuclear plant that a ship owner just doesn't have. In the military, with nuclear plant, there is a lot that you simply cannot do on board. You have to do the training with simulators. It's a bit like flying planes. All the things that can go wrong, you can't demonstrate them in the air. You have to use simulator training. That is essential for the safe operation of the plant, but not the sort of thing that a commercial ship owner will have any experience on. So the provider of the plant is going to have to play a much larger role in this if it is to have any commercial attraction.
For those of you that don't know, Mike was on nuclear submarines, so he will know rather more about it. But fortunately, I'm pleased to say that I got our trainee to research this afternoon whether there were any commercial vessels with that are nuclear powered, and as far as his research was, the answer was no. He said that, that there are studies to develop nuclear reactors for the commercial ships. And one of them is a company called New Pro Ship. I don't know if you've come across that, which is a consortium of Norwegian Maritime Authority, universities and shipbuilders. And the aim is to develop a nuclear plant. But none have been produced yet. And my understanding, you'd know far better than me because you'll have been into ports in a nuclear submarine, but the difficulty is actually getting ports to accept a nuclear powered ship into port, which I've always thought is going to be the challenge. Having said that, we've got our colleagues in the US are very keen on the development of nuclear power, and they seem to think that it will appear in shipping, in due course. And I think some people say that the only way that shipping is ever going to reach its, environmental targets is through an element of nuclear power.
The only commercial nuclear plant at sea is Russian icebreakers. And that's simply because of problems with fuel and very low temperatures. And the Americans had the Savannah, the Germans had the Otto Hahn, the Japanese had the Mutsu, but it all faded away.
But to answer the second part of your question as to whether the manufacturers of the new technologies are going to have to take a more active role long term in helping to operate ships. I mean, there are some examples of that I can think of in companies. I remember ABB, for example, being involved in remote diagnostics of things which they'd provided, like azimuthing pods, for example. But in terms of the liability coverage, the very standard acceptance, I think, is that you get a 12-month guarantee, and that's it. If you want to cover yourself with insurance beyond that, then either the operator, the owner of the ship, has got to take out insurance which will cover it against the failure of that particular type of technology, or the shipyard does. And it may be that the provider of the equipment will provide a service contract, and indeed a lot of providers of equipment, I know particularly in the aircraft industry, are very keen on doing that because they make a lot of money out of it. But in terms of liability coverage, I think that the 12-month position is likely to remain for some time. And of course, it's not only the shipyard which offers a 12-month guarantee, but of course they go back to back with their manufacturers and suppliers, so that they would say, and sometimes they're asked for 24-month guarantees of particular pieces of equipment. They'll say, well, we'll do it if our supplier will give 24 months, and then there's usually a cost involved. So, but really long-term coverage against, for example, potential latent defects is I think very difficult to obtain, and I think it's very difficult to get a shipyard or its supplier to stand behind that. I have a case at the moment where a ship which is 10 years old, was delivered 10 years ago, has been discovered to have asbestos on board, and who bears the liability for that at this stage? Sorry?
Where was it built?
I'm not telling you.
Okay.
Actually, it has a major bearing on this case as it happens. But
so I think we've overrun enough. So I'd like to thank Ian and Fiona and Andrew for speaking, and I'd like to thank you all for coming and listening. And the only other thing I was going to say is we've had some questions by email, but because of the time, we will answer those by email. If that's okay. So thank you very much, and thank you for coming.
I just would like to add a final thanks on behalf of the LSLC and YMP and all attendees. I would like to thank, first of all the panelists for speaking today and for the effort that goes into preparing such interesting and informative presentation. I must say that this is what makes the LSLC-YMP event successful. So thank you very, very much. And a special thanks to Haynes Boone for sponsoring today's reception, and especially to William and Fiona for their input and for adopting such a practical approach in presenting the topics, and for giving us a comprehensive picture of the current market. And also to the organizing committee, and particularly to Ian GAUNT for the arbitration tips on what the tribunal may find helpful, and Andrew Stevens for his times, ideas, all the dedication in planning and supporting this event. And last but not least, I would like to express my gratitude to Dr. Aleka Shepherd and to Gerard Matthews for his help and invaluable assistance at all stages of organizing today's event, and to all attendees for your enthusiasm, questions, and active participation this evening. Before we go, I have one final task, which is I would like to invite all of you to our next LSLC event, which is taking place on the 8th of May. The topic will be on fraudulent presentation of shipping documents under letter of credit, how to square the circle. I hope as many of you can participate and join us. Thank you very much for your attention, and please do enjoy the reception, for me virtually, but I'm sure you'll enjoy it.